Habari, jina langu ni Nio, host wa continent. Karibu, take a seat and a cup of tea, and let's talk Africa. Um, there's this image you see that keeps circulating online, and you probably have seen it. It shows arrows of wealth flowing from Africa, South America, so basically much of the global south. And when you look at this picture, it does feel true. And I think perhaps that is why people often say Africa, part of Asia, Latin America, or these countries that have experienced colonialism and economic dependence, they're referred to as poor. And so most people explain this as okay, the West have stolen their resources, they took it and left them with broken systems. And there's a lot of truth to this because we know a lot of centuries with slavery, colonial conquest, forced labor, resource extraction, and unequal trade that Africa has suffered for many, many years. And it is obvious that the modern global economy did not begin on equal footing. And I think this history matters. Think about this. The colonial rule deliberately restructured African societies around resource extraction. They prioritized the export of raw materials, and at the same time, they're also importing expensive finished products. So this led to a lot of local African industries to get destroyed. The colonialists too, they drew these arbitrary borders, and African leaders did not participate. These colonialists, they limited education just so that they can produce few compliant administrators instead of empowering citizens. And we had a lot of countless examples of such cases. If you are from Congo, or you know the history, if you think about 1885 to 1960s, this is a time where most enterprises were doing ivory and wild rubber. You know, a lot of Congolese, they were forced into brutal labor quotas during the red rubber system, and one, they had to produce a certain amount of rubber, or they would face mutilation, they would massacres or burn the whole village. And so a lot of people died. And so education at this time, it was very limited. So it was controlled by Catholic missions who are still actually involved in some African schools today. So the education at this time, it focused more on basic literacy and religious instructions to produce low level clerks and interpreters for the administration. And that does not sound like empowerment. That does not sound like this education was designed to empower the citizens. Another example, if you're from Nigeria, you know, around the same time, 1900 to 1960, the society at the time, it was centered on extracting palm oil. Another quick example is the French in the West, in West Africa, the Portuguese in Angola. These are the patterns we see that are widespread across these European colonies that have been around Africa for many, many centuries. And so when independence arrived, many nations they did not inherit neutral systems. They inherited these extractive systems. And so, yes, the damage was real. It's there, we see it. And I remember, or you probably have gone through the same, in high school, there's this question in history they ask of how colonization benefited Africa or that country in particular where you're from. And I remember writing big essays on infrastructure that they built, such as schools, hospitals, roads, and a lot of other things. And, you know, they sure did because we see them around in some places. But today, when I look at some cases, I wonder. For instance, in some nations, you'll see that the Africa rails were built as lines running from resource-rich interiors such as mines or cash crop plantations directly to coastal ports for rapid export, and that makes sense. These were not connecting major population centers. No, they were not connecting neighboring regions, or at least to facilitate internal trade and integration. Not at all. So they left independent nations, but with fragmented networks. I'll give you an example. You might know the the British East Africa, I think it's Kenya Uganda Railway. Uh, so they constructed this, and this line was running from the port of Mombasa, inland in Kenya, to Kisumu to access Uganda. So the Portuguese also another example in Angola. They built a port, I think a port of Labito, and this is where the Belgian Congo, I think they were doing copper from Katanga and then sending direct to the port. And there is so many other examples you can think of. And so today, a lot of these infrastructures are dead. They are inoperable. And I wonder why? Why, if they're so useful, why? Why is that the case? But if you think about it, when the colonialists left Africa, their colonies basically, they're left with lack of technical skills. They were, and a lot of these railways, you can see the tracks, the cables, the metals were all stolen and sold for scrap for by citizens. And so at the time, there are also not a lot of engineers or managers that would manage them. And actually, if you see the history, many expatriates at the time they left at independence, and this was not good because it created like a skill vacuum, and that's where corruption was born. And corruption was at peak at this time. The funds that were sent to maintain some of these infrastructures was embezzled. And but I think here is a real question to ask. It's been decades post independence. This topic is still the same. It has been over centuries that nations got their independence. So, how come this picture today does not explain the outcome? Why do we still see resources leaving? So, it makes me wonder, was independence actually independence? And is it, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and probably one that you can help me understand this. Because the truth is, history explains how inequality started, but it does not fully explain why it continues in the same form decades later. So, after independence, we know that countries that shared a lot of similar experiences, they began to diverge. We have a lot of examples. Some countries built relatively stable institutions and different growth path, but others they remain stuck in the cycles of instability, dependence, and disappointment. So, what changed? When I thought about this, I thought one of the things that changed after independence is urgency or accountability or responsibility. And I think this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, especially for us as Africans. Because the truth is, acknowledging injustice does not remove responsibility. In fact, it increases it. And I think one of the most overlooked factors is institutions. So, the colonial systems were centralized and extractive, but after independence, these systems they could either be reformed or captured. And in many cases, we know that power became personal rather than institutional. The rules they were adjusted around individuals instead of individuals being constrained by rules. And This is why, in my opinion, I think the real issue is not simply how long leaders stay in power, because we know other regions have long serving leadership and they still develop. And so, what makes a difference is whether power is constrained by institutions or constrained by incentives and performance. Let's look at these countries: Botswana, Mauritius, and Rwanda. They would be a great example of how reforming or building inclusive institutions turns potential traps into growth path. So Botswana got their independence in 1966. They had a very low GDP and minimal infrastructure, and they managed, diamond revenues. And then they build rules around transparent institutions. They started investing in education, health. And so you also know Mauritius shifted from sugar dependency, and diversified their economy, where they involved in textile, tourism, and finance. And these were all through programmatic policies and strong rule of law. For the case of Rwanda, where I'm from, rebuilding after the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, they prioritized reconciliation, anti corruption, and performance based governance. And I think these stand in contrast to some cases where institutions were personalized. For example, Zimbabwe, they declined from breadbasket to hyperinflation, a lot of resource mismanagement, and they had similar mineral wealth to Botswana. It's numbers you can read, and I think corruption too follows the same logic. It is you'll notice that most people describe corruption as a culture or moral, but I think it's usually institutional, because when oversight is weak and consequences are rare, misuse becomes normal. Then trust erodes, investment slows down, and progress becomes fragile. And another thing, you will see that education actually reveals another layer of that we rarely confront, in my opinion. In Africa, access to education has expanded and is still progressing tremendously. But inclusion has not always been followed. And this is what I mean. In many African societies, advancement still depends on mastery of a colonial language rather than the ability alone. And so intelligence exists everywhere, but opportunity does not often belong anywhere. And so there are these untapped minds that we always mention about, and they are real. And they are real because the structure exclusion wastes talent. And it makes me wonder, how many minds are we structurally excluding because the system was never designed to include them? And it's obvious to us say that colonialism built that hierarchy, where independence did not automatically dismantle the hierarchy, which is obvious. Another thing that I think never changed: mobility matters a lot. We know development depends on movement of people, ideas, capital, trading between countries. But across much of Africa, borders remain barriers. They are not bridges. Traveling is very difficult, and it makes regional trade very, very limited. And you might think it's such fragmentation, it reduces scale, because without scale, economic growth struggles. That's the fact. And then something we are very proud of is demographic of Africa. I think Africa is one, it's actually true. It is one of the youngest regions on earth, the world's lowest potential demographic dividend. And if jobs match education, so that should be a historic advantage, in my opinion. But education, it expanded so much faster than job creation. And so people rose their expectation faster than opportunities were being available. And so economies cannot absorb talent. And then with this, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of social tension that is going up. And the question is that a failure of youth or a failure of the systems? You help me think this through. But let's be clear and honest to ourselves. It would be terrible and misleading to pretend saying that external forces no longer matter. They do. Africa is still part of the world. We know global rules, the global trade rules. They still discourage value addition in Africa. The financial systems, they still limit the policy space. Capital still flows more easily towards extraction than transformation. And many of today's systems were built in a different era and for different beneficiaries. And sorry to say, but Africa was not only a victim of history, in some ways, it still operates inside systems that default against it. But let's be hopeful. I have truth that changes everything. Uh, Knowing the damage does not remove responsibility. If the system is unfair, understanding it becomes survival. If the rules disadvantage us, positioning ourselves within them and eventually reshaping them becomes the work. Because we know waiting for fairness has never built a nation. So victimhood explains the past, but as I mentioned earlier, agency determines the future. So we know the history, uh, we know the damage, we know the systems, and we know at least broadly the vision we want: dignity, opportunity, stability, and real sovereignty. So the ball is no longer outside the field, the ball is in our hands. And that means um, building institutions that outlast individuals, leadership constrained by systems, not personalities, education that includes rather than filters, integration rather than fragmentation, accountability, and not as a slogan, but as a requirement. And this is not about denying history. I think this is about refusing to be frozen by it. And so this image really tells us an important story about where the world began. But the next chapter depends on who accepts the responsibility for where it goes, which is why I think this image is very powerful. So self determination is not only freedom from domination. I think it's the discipline of stewardship. And that responsibility belongs to all of us as Africans. Thank you very much for staying with me. Share your comments, your opinions, your thoughts, and again, subscribe to Continent. I will see you in the next one.